Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your Hobgoblin host Hunter, and this is Hobby Goblin Studios. How's it going, guys? This week we're finally back to a proper terrain build. I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do, and that wasn't very good because it was already Thursday. In times like these, it's important to have an inspiration system, or a brain trust. A brain trust is a group of like-minded people or friends that you can trust to give you feedback and inspiration. For me, this takes the form of a group chat that started way back when me and my friends first got into Warhammer. This was a place where we could send pictures of our new paint jobs and ask for feedback and opinions. We used to help each other grow as painters and as gamers. Over time, this evolved to include more people, some of whom were very focused on the game and very intense gamers, and other people like me who were more interested in the painting and artistic qualities of the hobby and would probably get their butts handed to them in a plastic baggie in any game that we would try to play. So I turned to these good friends of mine to ask them for some ideas of things that I could build quickly but still create something awesome with. And because of the awesome ideas that I got from my good buddies in this group chat, we're going to be doing a jungle pyramid kind of repurposed by the Imperium and plastered with propaganda and posters. The basic structure of the pyramid is simple enough. 4 square platforms stacked on top of one another. Typically you would probably use XPS foam for something like this, because it's a lot more sturdy and it's a lot less messy. But all I have on hand is a bunch of the white bubbly EPS packaging foam, so I'm going to have to make that work. I'm going to use my Proxxon wire cutter for this in order to get faster and smoother cuts, but a large kitchen knife would work here too, though it might tear up the foam just a little bit. Also, my measurements aren't super important here. I'm just trying to make sure that each level is going to be wide enough that my models can stand on them, and the piece will end up being playable. One of the problems with using the EPS foam is that it's considerably more difficult to carve into, whereas if I was using XPS insulation foam, that would take and hold impressions much better, but my EPS is going to end up ripping and tearing. In this particular case, that's actually a good thing, because I want the final product to be heavily worn down and ruined. Still, it's going to be important to be gentle when carving the individual blocks, because it's pretty easy to overdo this effect. To make the process a little faster, I'm going to be making pretty large bricks here, but if you want to make them smaller, that would be totally fine, and it may actually end up looking better, but with all the extra detail that I'm going to be adding in later, I'm not too concerned. One benefit of using the EPS foam, however, is that it's incredibly easy to break up and ruin, and this is going to create a pretty convincing texture. I'm going to just go wild here, ripping out corners and edges, running my knife blades sideways across certain areas, and just generally being chaotic and destructive. This is one of my favorite parts of projects like this. When you're using any type of styrofoam, it's a pretty good idea to coat it in Mod Podge to add durability. But especially so with EPS, as once you break into it, those little bubbles don't really stop falling out. Just like Jeremy from Black Magic Craft, I mix my Mod Podge with black paint so as to protect and base coat all in one step. This isn't the only layer of protection I'm going to use though. While the Mod Podge is still wet, I'm going to be sprinkling on some tile grout. This is going to do two things. First, it's going to dry as a hard layer of cement, protecting the foam underneath it. And secondly, it's going to provide an interesting stone texture. And as a bonus, it comes in a huge variety of colors, so if I choose a color I like, I don't have to paint my base coat, and I can just dry brush my highlights on and throw on a wash for the shadows. Once I get that tile grout on, I take the piece outside and hit it with a couple of coats of matte varnish. This is to just ensure that that tile grout is stuck down all the way. And it's also going to add just one extra layer of protection. I don't have any footage of this because I took it outside because I'm using a spray can and fumes in the basement. Not a great idea, but you get it. Just point and shoot. After that dries, it's time for a quick black wash. This isn't going to be anything fancy, just some heavily diluted black craft paint, although Jeremy has a wonderful video on how to make something a little bit nicer if you're interested in that. I'll try to remember to leave a link in the description below. This isn't only going to add in our shadows. You see, tile grout is a cement, and as such it's activated with water. So as we bathe our pyramid, we're also making sure that all of the tile grout has been wetted and will dry solid. So there won't be any dust blowing off of the piece or falling onto the table during gameplay. With that dry, it's time to move on to my highlights. For terrain, there's no need to use your expensive miniature paints. 50-cent a bottle craft paints are going to work just fine. These can be found in local supermarkets, dollar stores, or anywhere else that they may have a craft section. I just find a couple of colors that I think will complement the tile grout, and I start dry brushing. In this case, those colors happen to be khaki and antique white, both by Apple Barrel. So this piece is looking pretty good at this point, but I'm going for something more repurposed looking, like the Imperium of the 41st millennia has found this old ruin and turned it into something else, used it for their own purposes. So a big hunk of stone really isn't going to cut it here. So I asked myself, what's the easiest way to pull something into the grim dark future of 40K? And then it hit me. Pipes and catwalks. I don't quite recall where I got this idea from, but I know it's not my own original idea. So if anyone knows where this comes from, let me know in the comments. But I've had this under gravel fish tank filter sitting around waiting to be slapped onto some terrain for quite a while. These things are awesome for bridges and catwalks, or really any sort of industrial flooring. They snap together so it's not too tricky to work with, and once they're painted up to look like metal, they blend right into the environment. I just tried out a few different configurations until I was happy, and then I moved on to the pipes. I start by chopping up some PVC pipe and started playing around with different orientations. I didn't have a super solid idea of what I wanted, but I quickly settled on keeping them tucked underneath the platforms to keep them out of the way and make sure the piece remained playable. Now that I had an idea of what the piece would look like, it was time to glue the pipes and catwalks together. Notice on the pipes I'm going to sprinkle some baking soda onto the super glue. This instantly cures the super glue, meaning I can get right to painting, but it also adds a texture. Once I paint it up, this should look like a rough weld. It's a small detail, but it really helps to sell the idea that these are metal pipes, not just painted plastic ones. It can sometimes be difficult to get paint to stick to different types of plastics, so I always like to prime plastics with a rattle can. I went and grabbed a few cans that were nearly empty, that I wouldn't get any use out of otherwise. And then I sprayed everything down so that the paints I use later are going to have something to stick to. Then I go ahead and I break out the airbrush to base coat everything black. Obviously this could be done by hand, but I was feeling a little bit lazy. For the pipes, I do a pretty simple rust paint job. I use a technique called overbrushing. This is basically the same as dry brushing, except you're not removing nearly as much paint from your brush. So I'm going to start overbrushing with the Apple Barrel Candy Bar Brown across the tops of all of the pipes. You'll know you're overbrushing if it looks streaky. As I start to run out of paint, this becomes more of a dry brush. And I use this to go down the sides and underneath of the pipes to help blend this brown into the black smoothly. Once that's done, it's just a matter of mixing some yellow into our chocolate bar brown and stippling random spots all over. And then to really sell the effect, I'm going to stipple in some big, bright orange spots, and the pipes are going to be done. So far, everything's looking really desaturated and really brown, so I knew I wanted to add some sort of color here. Typically in construction zones or in any industrial site, you're going to see these diagonal black and yellow stripes that are going to denote any hazardous area. So I'm deciding to hand paint these strips onto the perimeter of every catwalk. I break out my yellow and I start freehanding them on. Yellow is a pretty difficult color to get full opacity with, so it's going to take 3 or 4 coats. Because of this, I'm not too concerned with making my lines very straight or evenly spaced, because the black I use is going to perfectly cover in just 1 coat, so I can use that to fix any of my errors with these lines. I said earlier that with terrain you should be using cheap craft paints. However, I haven't been able to find a cheap metallic paint that I liked. For this reason, I'm not going to be using much metallics. I still want to have some metal on these catwalks, but there's no way I'm using up all my miniature paints to do this. So I'll dry brush a brown all over to represent rust and dirt. Then I dry brush some Citadel Lead Belcher down the center where the most wear would be. Then I break out Vallejo Metal Color Chrome and do the exact same thing, but in a smaller area. With everything painted, it's time to start gluing everything in place. I use hot glue here because it's fast. I'm not being careful here either because I don't care if it oozes out at the seams. I really just want it to hold. Once everything's in place and the hot glue is cooled, I can hide those seams. Oh, and I'm going to leave off two of the pipe sections so I don't have to make a base for this piece. And maybe I can use the pipes separately as individual pieces of terrain. It's always nice to have some sort of versatility and modularity with your terrain. Now you could call this piece finished here, but I wanted to add a little more detail and a little more variety. Plus, I kind of promised my group chat buddies that I would show them how to do posters, so let's see what we can find on the internet. I'm just going to go ahead and Google Warhammer 40K posters, and one of the first results is going to be this page of pre-sized posters. So that was pretty easy. Let's just hit print and I'll start cutting out some of my favorites. It's actually pretty easy to apply these posters. Just paint on some white glue to the backs, stick it in place, and seal over the top of it with some matte Mod Podge or any other varnish that you like. If all you have is PVA glue, go ahead and seal them with that too. I also make sure to curl some up and glue them onto the horizontal plane to make it seem as if it fell. I wrinkle some up and shove them in corners and generally make them look like trash. It's just another small detail that really adds some visual interest and character to the piece. At this point, I still felt like we were missing some color, so I thought, why not throw some moss on it? Moss is a pretty quick and easy effect. Thanks yet again, Jeremy. Black Magic Craft has shown off this wonderful moss technique in the past, and I absolutely love it. Just mix about equal parts flock with PVA glue to create this sort of moss paste that you can just smear all over everything. Once the glue dries, it'll be clear and you'll have a pretty convincing moss effect. Now I know someone is inevitably going to type the comment, "Hey dude, moss only grows on one side." Well, I don't care. This is art, and an artist's job is not to recreate the real world one for one, but rather to be inspired by it and create something unique using elements from real life. Besides, I think moss growing on all sides of some ruined pyramid is the least unrealistic thing about Warhammer or D&D or whatever other fantasy game we're playing. So this piece was a ton of fun to build, and I think it was really interesting. I love the jungle D&D adventure meets 40K kind of aesthetic going on here. The mixture of fantasy and sci-fi is a really interesting mind space, and I want to encourage you guys out there to play around with that for yourselves and let me know what you guys come up with. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and thank you for being part of the 21% of people that actually make it to the end of my videos. If you'd like to support me any further, make sure you hit like and subscribe. And go ahead and check out my website, hobbygoblinstudios.com. There you can read a little bit about me and see some other work I've done and contact me about any commission work you might want done. And until next time, keep on crafting.